dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure for me, but also for my colleague, Karel Velle, Permanent Secretary of the Flemish Academy, to welcome you in this palace of the academies, in the heart of Europe and consequently in the gravity center of ALLEA. ALLEA operates in a collaborative mode, and it was therefore quite appropriate to host this General Assembly and the Symposium in a context of perfect collaboration between the two Belgian Royal Academies of Arts and Sciences. 2022 is far from being an insignificant year for us. 250 years ago, the Empress of Austria, Maria Theresa, decided to found an Académie impériale et royale, to be sure that it was very important, des sciences et belles lettres de Bruxelles, from which the Royal Academy of Belgium, known as the Theresian, originated. And it is not irrelevant to consider for a moment the context of this foundation. While the 18th century is characterized by the blooming of the academies, in the second half of the century, the huge territory of Austro-Hungarian Empire, with the exception of its Italian possessions, was devoid of academies. In the middle of this century, all the great European monarchies and republics could take pride in being the seat of at least one academy, mostly on the model of the French one. The French Academy, created in 1666 by Colbert, financed by the state and composed by a few members, was the dominant model in monarchist Europe and especially in the Catholic countries. The academies aim to create a balance in their interest between natural science and the humanities. But another model was as efficient as it was different, the model offered by the Royal Society in London. This society has been created in 1666, so 4 years before the French one, independently funded and largely outside the power of the king. This academy had acquired an international reputation for its willingness to associate theory and practice, and to devote itself to what is called today research and development. A vision and even a philosophy that had been strongly promoted by Leibniz, who was for a long time president of the Prussian Academy in Berlin. It is therefore not surprising that the Imperial and Royal Academy of Brussels wished to draw inspiration from these two models, taking over from the French Academy the link with power, but with a clear purpose of boosting the economy. The challenge was to stimulate the development of the Belgian province through science. In the mid-1760s, however, the University of Louvain was the target of criticism because they were not teaching any mathematics, any physics, any history, or even literature. In the view of many observers, it remained frozen in a scholastic philosophy. The new academy offered a solution to this scientific stagnation and could give hope for the revitalization of the socio-economic landscape. So, transforming science and even transforming research cultures in order to reshape the science policy relations was the aim of our founder, Maria Theresa. Quite nothing new, you will see. The role of the academies in these times was quite obvious. But the question is today, how can academies help in transforming science? First, by defending a long-term vision of research. If research wants to be sustainable, it must recognize the need to work on a long-term scale and not in the perpetual rush imposed by the pressure to publish. We need to recover control over time in research, and academies are particularly suitable environments for long-term reflection. Secondly, by implementing multidisciplinarity. Not only must the major challenges facing our society, such as climate, health, or inequalities, be tackled by institutions that are not structurally short-term, but they must also be the subject of cross-disciplinary approaches. This multidisciplinarity is the DNA of the academies. Thirdly, by advocating the importance of building robust data collections that are open to all. The corpora of knowledge that have been a priority concern of academies in previous centuries are more essential than ever to the development of knowledge. And finally, by contributing to a better interaction between science and democracy. As Pierre Rosanvallon has noted, democratic progress is not only the extension of participation or the multiplication of referenda. It is perhaps above all the development of what he calls democratic functionalities, such as evaluation, deliberation, monitoring, or control. According to him, the Parliament no longer supports them. One of the great challenges of our contemporary democracies is to institutionalize and keep alive the major democratic functions, for example, through independent authorities. This can be achieved through what we call technology assessment, but also through a practice within the academies themselves of these democratic functionalities. Deliberation, control, evaluation are practices that the academies have promoted since their creation. It is within the academies that the major questions of science have been tackled, challenged, and explored. I have no doubt that the academies still have a major role to play, particularly in defining scientific consensus and organizing discussions. So, if there is no society without trust, trust in science is one of the challenges of our democracies if they want to protect themselves from irrationality and arbitrariness. To conclude, I would like to thank all the staff of ALLEA and of the Belgian academies who have prepared this General Assembly and the Symposium since a long time. And I would also like to thank all the speakers for their contributions today and tomorrow. The KVAB, Flemish Academy, and the Academy of Belgium, the French-speaking Academy, are proud, very proud, to be able to welcome you in this context of a long historical tradition, which should be more inspiring than ever. I thank you very much. We are in time, and I would like to introduce briefly the president of ALLEA. Everybody knows him, but I have to introduce him warmly. Professor Antonio Loprieno became the president of ALLEA in May 2018. Antonio studied Egyptology, linguistics, and Semitic studies at the University of Torino in Italy. In the 80s, he taught at various European universities, including the University of Göttingen in Germany and the University of Perugia in Italy, of course. And from 89 to 2000, he was professor of Egyptology at the University of California, Los Angeles. He served at first as professor at the University of Basel from 2000 until 2006, and then as rector from this university until 2015. Among other positions, he served as president of the Swiss Academies of Arts and Sciences, president of the Jacobs University Bremen, president of the Rectors' Conference of the Swiss University, the CRUS, and he holds the presidency of the Austrian Science Board. Antonio, la parola spettate.
Merci, Vivier. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you today. And in spite of all the things that Professor Vivier said, my job today is basically that of entertaining you until the really important people come. And the really important people are actually the State Secretary, Belgian State Secretary, the Commissioner, and Mariya Gabriel, and particularly Professor Koopmans, will open today's and tomorrow's symposium. First of all, let me also thank the partners and actual organizers of this event, the two Belgian academies, in the person of their secretary, perpetual secretary. Are you called still perpetual? Yes. Well, you see, this is an interesting also European, so which this connects Belgium rather to the French-speaking world, because in France, the position, the actual position of leadership in an academy is a perpetual secretary, perpetual probably until death. But as I've heard, actually, is now this perpetuity is somewhat also reduced, much to your advantage. So both of the French-speaking and of the Flemish, Dutch-speaking academies, so Didier Viviers and Karel Felle, who is outside, but also in special terms, his predecessor, Freddy Dumortier, who is also here. I would also add to Professor Vivier's thanks my own for the contribution by the staff, both of ALLEA and particularly of the Académie Royale and the Koninklijke Vlaamse Academie der Wetenschappen van België. The particular event today is that, and tomorrow, is that we are going to hold this scientific event in a hybrid format. And I think it's fair to state that hybridity has become a feature of our academic life altogether. So it has become perhaps the most typical sign of this new normality that we have been talking about. Also, to a certain extent, to be seen within this context of transforming science that I will come back to shortly. And thirdly, it is more than a serendipity that we are hosting these events and we are holding these events here in Brussels, because as we were just reminded by Didier, this falls together with 250 years of academic presence in this country, and at a particular point in which academies also played a very significant role in the development of European science as a whole and in positioning our continent in this respect. My function is that of chairing ALLEA, of which I will give you now really very, very few indications, basically referring to our strategy. And perhaps the way we can combine these 7 functions or purposes that ALLEA has given itself is to describe to you a kind of evolution, perhaps, that we are all experiencing at ALLEA. And that is also to be viewed within the context of transforming science, which is the fact that we started out, and we still are, de facto a service in networks for our academies. That is our primary function, that of serving European academies and facilitating their cooperation. But in addition to this main original function, recent years have required ALLEA to really engage more directly into science and society as a whole, to a certain extent going beyond its original position as producer of science and representation of science, and engaging in a dialogue with society as a whole, to which I will return shortly. And the third main dimension, in addition to this communicative role, also with society, and not only within academies themselves, is the policy advice or the intervention of ALLEA in the public domain, also at the level of the Council of European, national, depending institutions. So there's an element in which our original function here is being, by the events themselves, is being challenged and expanded to reach out to different dimensions. This has also been reflected in a variety of publications that I will now perhaps shortly review some of them, simply because they bear a direct relevance to the themes where we are and to the themes that we are going to discuss. One is perhaps what is our bestseller on the list of ALLEA, and which is the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity. It's quite fascinating that this product of our primarily of our working group, and then endorsed by the community of European academies, has become and is continuously becoming a point of reference for the development of research integrity policies at, I would dare to say, almost all national levels within Europe, not only the European Union, but within Europe as a whole. This is a great sign for us. It means it corresponded to a need, and we served our constituencies appropriately. The other one is the report on genome editing for crop improvement, which I mentioned because actually it was produced under the leadership of the Belgian Royal Flemish Academy, and so it's particularly appropriate. Then delivering Horizon Europe, where we had a direct response also at the political levels, and more recent statements also that on research assessment that will constitute a basic role. Climate sustainability will also be one of the most important topics of tomorrow's discussion, and I see that the second of the most important people has already emerged. So welcome to us, Commissioner Gabriel. Before turning the word to the political institutions and to the keynote address, I would like to focus on three main aspects which, in our eyes, have justified this topic of transforming science and the way in which transforming science is interpreted. And I have chosen three words that capture, as it were, this idea of transforming science. The first one is institutional term. Until 20, 30 years ago, institutions of research, such as academies or universities, were actually concerned with science as a whole and did not have the need to engage in what we might call a market. Right now, we are in a situation in which academies, universities, also are requested thanks or because of our connection with society, to display their own contribution, their own specific contribution, their own strategy, their own unique selling point. And that is, of course, that has transformed completely the relationship between science and society. And now I see that also the third of our three important people has come. So I should also expedite my observation. And so I will come back to, so I will shortly mention one sentence of the other two, inclusive excellence. And here I'm happy that the Commissioner can hear that. The European Union has been seminal in this respect, because inclusive excellence is precisely the way in which now what we thought would be a distinctness of high science is actually being approached from a different position, in which it is not only, certainly also, but not only a question of performance at the highest level of science and scholarship, but also involves paying attention to emerging or otherwise so groups of society that can contribute to research excellence, thus transforming science as an institution as a whole. And third, global challenges. Until very few years ago, our view of science was a very disciplinary one. And it still is, and it needs to be from the point of view of the progress of science. But we have all come to realize as society that the real challenges, the real issues of societies are not disciplinary. And that is something that also requires an institutional, not only an individual, but an institutional transformation of science as a whole. To the presentation of the specific items that we will treat in these 2 days, we will come later. But first of all, it is my great and distinct privilege to welcome the Belgian State Secretary for Scientific Policy, Recovery Program and Strategic Investments, Thomas Dermine. He is an economist from Charleroi, and was appointed as State Secretary for Economic Recovery and Strategic Investment for responsibility for science policy, so something very close to our heart and also to our activity here, and Deputy to the Ministry for the Economy and Labour of the current federal government led by Alexander De Croo. Within the federal government, he is responsible for steering the coordination of the Belgian recovery plan and ensuring close cooperation between the European Commission and Belgium. And in parallel with this mission, Thomas also supervises the federal science policy, including 10 federal scientific establishments and a multitude of competencies ranging from Belgian aerospace policy to the management of federal museums and federal research policy. So, State Secretary, it's a great pleasure to host you.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. And on behalf of the Belgian government, I would like to welcome our European colleague in Brussels. It's our Belgian national capital, but it's also the capital of yours, is the capital of Europe. So welcome all in Belgium, and I hope that you will have fruitful discussions in the hours and the days to come. I would like also to start by apologizing for just coming in and just coming out just afterwards. I'm the most junior member of the government. I'm the youngest member of the government. And when we have a seating of the parliament in a plenary session, it's an obligation to have one member of the government which stays in the room at any time, from very early in the day till very late in the night, sometimes just doing nothing excepting listening very carefully to the colleagues in the parliament. And very often it falls on the shoulder of the most junior member of the parliament. So I have to run in and to run out of the parliament, but it was very important to me to be with you, with our dear commissioner being here, and with all the team of the academy, even if it's for a short moment of time. Anyway, I will not do a big and lengthy speech, but just to address 3 questions very shortly. The first one is, and it's more of a question which is relevant for our Belgian colleagues, the Dutch-speaking and the French-speaking ones. And the first question is, why do we still need scientific policy at the federal level in Belgium, knowing that most of the competencies are decentralized in the regions and in the communities? The second question is, why is science in big trouble, and why is science much needed in these troubled times than it was before? And the third question is, why do we need to strengthen the role of science in policy making these days? So the first question, why do we still need policy, science policy at the federal level in Belgium? And actually, for the European colleagues who are not well versed into the very, I would say, passionate stories of Belgian federalism, 40 years ago, science and culture used to be managed in a centralized state at the federal level. And then we've had a long story of decentralization in Belgium, with an increasing share of scientific policy being decentralized either at the regional level or at the community level on the French-speaking side, because we can't do things in a simple manner in Belgium. And so the previous government had a very clear picture that science policy at the federal level should lead to a stage where it would entirely disappear. It's the kind of like end of a logical story where we start with full competencies at the federal level and we end somewhere where everything sits at the decentralized level. And so when I entered in my position a few months ago, I asked all the colleagues and many colleagues in the room, okay, is this a good vision for the scientific policy at the federal level? Is our science policy indeed what we call in French a compétence résiduelle, what we call in Dutch in restbevoegdheid? And so I discussed with all the colleagues, many of whom are in the room today, and we came to the conclusion that actually it still has a lot of sense to do scientific policy at the federal level in Belgium. And why? Because of three very simple reasons. The first one is that no matter what you think about the future of Belgium, whether you are an hardcore regionalist who doesn't believe in the future of Belgium as a country, or if you are on the opposite, a true Belgicain, you can't deny that no matter what the future looks like, we have a common history. At least for a short period of time, minimum 192 years, we have been together. And in this period, we have accumulated a lot of things. The directeur des archives du royaume est avec nous. He has 300 kilometers of archives everywhere around the country. We have the biggest collection of African art in Tervuren. We have amazing piece of arts in the Musée des Beaux-Arts, in the Bibliothèque Royale. And so the question is, no matter what you think about the future, we have this patrimonium in common. And this patrimonium, no matter what you think about the future evolution of this country, it is a duty to study it, to show it to the public, and to make sure it can cross times. That's one reason. The second reason is that scale matters. A big chunk of the scientific policy at the federal level is space policy. And if you come as the Belgian entity at the table of the European Space Agency, you are the fifth net contributor to the budget. So you have a voice that matters. If you come as the Flemish Minister of Space, the Walloon Minister of Space, and the Brussels Minister of Space, you would be number 12, number 19, and number 26. And if you come at the table in that position, for some matters, the sum is bigger than the parts. And it's, I mean, you are in a better negotiating position if you are the 5th contributor at the table than the sum of the smaller parts. And the third reason is, I believe, more relevant for our European friends in the room, is this intimate relationship between policy and politics. My wife is a Romanist. I don't know how to say it in English, but she studied at university the French and the Latin languages. And she's always very proud to say, look, you spend a lot of times in your professional life to speak English, but French and many language with a Latin origin are much more richer and nuanced than the English language. I say, yeah, maybe it's true, but for one of the most important words in the management of the city, it's not the case. And it's the case for politique. In French, we use the word politique for everything. In English, they make a distinction between two things that are fundamentally apart, which is politics and policy. Policy is what is the best decision to take if you want to obtain a certain result. And that is a scientific discipline. And politics is the game. Politics is the relationship of power between men, is the electoral gain, and is the result of electoral institutions. And those are two things that are completely different. But in French, because of this confusion sémantique, we don't make at all this distinction between policy and politics. And my view is that so as long as we will do politics at the federal level in Belgium, we will need policy. We will need scientific institutions that make sure that the decision we take, the political decision we take, are fed with policy evaluation led by strong policy federal institutions. My second question is, what's the paradox of science in our period? We are just out of a very strong crisis with COVID-19. We are in a new crisis with the Ukrainian crisis. And the paradox of science is that we've never talked as much about science. I mean, I don't know the situation in your country, but in Belgium you could not have a look at TV, at the news on TV, and you had Gaussian curves, and you had experts with white shirts showing the Gaussian curve about the spread of the epidemic, etc. So science has been at the core of the debates for the last 2 years like it has never been before. I mean, people were just like expecting to go back to a bar because of a vaccine discovery program somewhere in a random university or research center. It's quite amazing how strongly we have been depending on science for the entire functioning and the entire social life of society. And the paradox is that science has never been so important as it is today, but on the other hand, it has never been challenged so much. I mean, on the same TV show in Belgium, but I'm sure it's the same in other countries in Europe, you had well-known scientists and you had random citizens with opinions that were completely non-scientifically based about how to manage an epidemic. And that's the challenge of today, is how can we reaffirm the basic principle that we are all equal in rights, but that all opinions are not equal, and that an opinion which is formed based on a scientific method, an opinion which is peer-reviewed, is stronger and more valid and should have more impact on the public debate than opinions which are randomly emitted by citizens or fake scientists. That's the big challenge of our times. And so what should we do? And that's the third question. to place back science at the core of policy making in Belgium and in Europe. And I have 5, I would not say recommendation, but 5 leads that we should investigate. The first one is more money in science. It's very simple. It's a question of input. We have in Europe this target of 3% for R&D in the Lisbon Treaty, and I think that there are only a few countries across Europe that can reach that target. And I'm very comfortable as the Belgian government to talk about, because we are one of the few who are above the target, and we are with the Swedish colleagues with 3.5%, one of the first countries in Europe. But so that's a debate that should be a top political debate in every single member state. How can you give more stimulus? How can you give more incentives? How can you fund better and more science in all member states across Europe? The second lead of action is, how can you get more young people into science? I'm responsible for space policy, and I use this connection to space to make science sexy. We go into secondary school. If you talk about physics, about whatever scientific topic to a kid of 16 years old, the likelihood that he will find it boring is quite high, especially the way we teach it in Belgium. I mean, I'm well versed into the French-speaking part of Belgium. I don't know the case in Flanders, but I expect it to be slightly similar. And so how can we make it more sexy to learn science? If we go with an astronaut into a classroom of 16 years old, if you show that basically all the amazing things that you can apply based on core scientific principles, you are talking about something completely different. And so the question is really, how can we revise the way we teach science, the way we talk about science, to make it something which is less boring and which is more exciting for the young people? And I think there we have a lot of responsibility. The third way is that we should have more science in policy. I go back to my difference about policy and politics. I studied at ULB, Université Libre de Bruxelles, and I studied political science. And we had amazing classes. I read Kant, Hegel, I was an expert in the theory of Marx, etc. And then I went to the US and I studied a master in political science at Harvard University, but it was completely different. It was not a curriculum on whatever thinker of whatever century. It was, how can you design, how can you evaluate, and how can you apply the scientific methods to the public decision-making process. And honestly there, and I'm not talking for every part of Europe, but in Belgium, and I would say more in the Latin part of Europe, we don't have this tradition of designing and evaluating public policies with the same rigor than we do apply to scientific processes. And there I believe we should learn. And all academias around the world, all universities should develop curriculum to better train public policymakers on these processes. Because public policy making, unlike politics, is a science. The fourth area I would like to investigate is that we should have more scientists in policy making. A lot of my friends are pursuing their PhDs somewhere around the world, are leading brilliant academic career. And I feel when I tell them, hey, you should get, with all the expertise you have, you should get into the public debates. You should inform the media, you should inform the citizens that actually science has an opinion, and that opinion that scientists have do matter. And very often the reaction is, well, you know, I have to be focused on my tenure track. I have to, it's kind of dirty to get your hands into the public debate. And there we should completely change the mindsets and invert the mindset. I believe that especially in countries like Belgium, where education is a public good, when society has invested in your training so much, it's not dirty, but it's your duty to actually give back to society and to contribute to better informed policymaking. And the fifth and final recommendation is that not only we should have more scientists in policy, but we should have more scientists in politics. I was walking around the streets of Paris a few weeks ago, and in Paris, I'm sure everyone has noticed, you have these blue tags on the streets with the name of the streets, very famous, very beautiful tags with the name of the streets. And what's very funny is that you have the name of the street, but you have a second line beneath with what was the title and the occupation of the people whose name the street is named after. And so, for example, you have Rue Chateaubriand. He's a famous author, and he's a politician, a member of the French Assembly at his time. You have Rue Lavoisier, and there you see, of course, he's a famous scientist, but he was also actively involved into politics. And my question is, how come that the best scientists of our times have fled parliaments? And how comes that the individual in which society has invested the most are not active where they can contribute the most? And I know we have all busy agendas, and you need to have, I'm in the middle of it, time for your babies, time for everything, but it's a true question. How can we make sure, if we want to give back science, if we want to place back science at the core of policy making, how can we do it if we not actively involve the one who possess the best expertise? So that was my final word. It's more questions and reflection, but I hope it can inform your discussion. And once again, I wish you a very fruitful exchange in Brussels. Thank you very much.
To the babies, right? Merci, Monsieur le Secrétaire d'État. Thank you very much. And now it is my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome among us European Commissioner Mariya Gabriel, who is responsible for innovation, research, culture, education, youth, and sport at the European level. Under her leadership, both the New Horizon Europe program and Erasmus+, plus all the cultural strand of Creative Europe will be defined and implemented. We all know that her priorities are in the areas of excellence in research, innovation, and education, in tackling the research and innovation divide in Europe between East and West, North and South, and in positioning Europe as a strategic leader in innovation through the digital and green transition, with a particular attention to young people and to so far disadvantaged regions of our continent. Two of her mottos are "No one left behind" and "Think out of the box." And I have the suspicion that also this inclusive excellence that we discussed, and we will even more discuss, may actually derive from her pen, digital, so real or oral. As ALLEA, we have already had the honor and privilege to welcome Commissioner Gabriel on earlier occasions, both in our conference, if I remember correctly, on digital economy and society in 2019, and then, of course, at the General Assembly we held in her own original country, in Bulgaria, in Sofia, in 2018. Commissioner Gabriel, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I must say that it's first time that I see that inclusive excellence is discussed, and it's so on the top of the agenda. So thank you very much. I fully agree that we need to work together and we need to co-create together with you the content of this. So, Monsieur le secrétaire d'État, il est parti. Je sens que j'ai une petite sympathie pour les langues nuancées, mais je l'attribuerai à la solidarité féminine. Dear members of the ALLEA Governing Board, dear members of the ALLEA Academies of Science, dear distinguished speakers and guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, it's always a pleasure and honor for me to participate in your events, and thank you very much for inviting me to address the ALLEA Academies on a particularly daring topic of the transforming science. I'm aware of your excellent work and strong engagement in defending and promoting the values of science. I commend your initiatives through Science Advice for Policy by European Academies, supporting our scientific advice mechanism. And let me also thank you for the concrete actions in support to scientists and scientific institutions impacted by the war in Ukraine. All efforts to stay united are important, showing our strong resolve to defend our values and making science an inspiring source of dialogue. Well, the world is undergoing profound transformations. And if science has been evolving throughout the centuries, since its Greek times, if I may call that like that, we can expect that it will further evolve, responding to new realities, adapting to new contexts that characterize our time. And yes, we are confronted with multiple new and enduring challenges of unprecedented complexity. The war in Ukraine, the economic resilience in the post-COVID-19 recovery, the climate change and global warming, the increased biodiversity losses, the growing levels of inequality. So my first message is that the transformation of science is our collective responsibility. We need to ensure that science keeps its fundamental mission as the privileged vehicle for discovery, the ultimate expression of humanistic culture. There are so many contextual issues to consider. For instance, the enlarging of the perimeter of the world of science. In a hyper-connected society, we have more contact with citizens, opening new socio-dynamics for individuals and organizations. And there are phenomenal advances in research infrastructures and instrumentation. The vast amount of data and the use of high-performance computing pose many challenges, not only in terms of infrastructure, but also on the skills necessary to deal with complex systems. So allow me today to raise 3 points that need a call for our responsibility. And first, I start by the role of science advice to policy to increase trust in science. We live in fast-moving times, trying to emerge from the big socioeconomic impact of the COVID pandemic and now the war in Ukraine. Recent Eurobarometer indicates that 9 out of 10 European citizens have a positive opinion about science. It is encouraging, but we must continue our efforts to reinforce the independent support of science to policymaking. New types of interactions will be supported by abundance of information that is not always reliable. And it is our responsibility to defend the fundamental values of objectivity and scrutiny as essential elements to build trust. And we need to develop, together with all of you, a coherent vision We need to strengthen the different networks, processes, and policies that connect science and policy making in the member states and at the European level. With that purpose, we have started a transversal reflection on science for policy, and I invite you to participate in this reflection and debate on how our societies can improve their response to new challenges. That was mentioned already by the State Secretary. I'm really glad that again in the European Commission, together with all of you, we are well advanced. So definitely the next few months we need to deepen the discussion on this topic. So for me, what is really important, I insist, we need, together with all of you and the role of science advice to policy, to increase trust in science. Now I pass to a more science-centric issue about the need to strike the right balance between fundamental and applied sciences. The development of COVID-19 vaccines is a striking example. The European Research Council funded early steps of research on mRNA that led to the development of COVID-19 vaccines. It is important to recognize the importance of scientific intuition and serendipity. It is known that initial exploratory research was not for application on infectious disease, but for cancer vaccines. And allow me to share here a recent story. I recently handed the Solvay Prize 2020 to Professor Katalin Kariko as a recognition of her outstanding work on mRNA. And I was delighted with her lecture describing a lifelong experience from school times to the hard and long years of laboratory tests, validating the scientific intuition and ultimately allowing to save millions of lives. So it is our responsibility, and my team is fully aware, to support the European Research Council and at the same time reinforce the impact-driven research funded in another pillar of the Horizon Europe program, to create a science ecosystem fit for the future. We need to go one step further and address the bottlenecks that remains. For example, those hampering innovation to thrive. We recognize the persistent gap in terms of investments in downstream innovation. Our availability on venture capital is 4 to 5 times lower than in the United States. Without new, fresh blood companies in new technologies and fast adoption of digital technologies, the EU risks a gradual loss of global competitiveness. And it is our responsibility to help the innovative pillar of Horizon Europe program, because with your research, with your expertise, with your vision, research and innovation can work better hand in hand. And I know that for some of you, maybe that's a little bit frustrating, but I really don't like the sentences like Europe is lagging behind. No, Europe has to unlock its full potential. And especially with the new wave of innovation, the so-called deep tech. That's this world in the frontier between science and hardware. And here we need you to join those that have these innovative ideas, and I'm sure that we can do it in our own European way. No need to copy others. People will always choose the originals. We need really to define the added value of our own European approach. And count on my support for this. Finally, I would like to address the role of researchers and the research community. I'm always paying a lot of attention to the different official declarations. Very often when we talk about research and science and policy, how much time we mention this beautiful word researcher. That's what we are most proud in Europe. And I'm sure that the transformation of science will impact on researchers and on research organizations, and that's why, again, we need your full engagement and vision. According to the latest Eurostat figures, there are nearly 2 million researchers working in the member states, 500,000 more compared to 2010. Most researchers work in the business enterprise sector, 55%, the higher education sector, 33%, followed by the governmental sector, 11%. So we have already representatives, huh? It's good, we have a solid base. But it is essential to increase these numbers if we want to bet on a knowledge-based society. We need to attract more talents and to adapt the assessment of research and researchers to respond to emerging trends. Researchers, and in particularly the young generations, it's the European Year of Youth, it's the best time to discuss about this too, are often engaged, and we know that, in precarious and short-term working perspectives. New research posts are often on a project-by-project base. It has a negative impact on employment conditions, career development perspectives. So I think that it is our responsibility to offer long-term perspectives and strengthen and diversify the research career paths by, for example, promoting mobility between academia and industry. And you know that that's one of the main priorities in the new European research area. And for that, yes, together with my team too at the European Commission, we are working on a mix of legislative framing initiatives, the investment incentives in the context of the European research area, and the European strategy for universities. So research assessment systems need to respond to emerging characteristics of the new scientific dialogue. Our society has growing access to information, but not necessarily to knowledge. Our citizens expect us to work better the boundary between science and education. And modern scientific processes deliver much more than scientific papers. There is more flexibility and interaction which challenge old ways to implement scientific scrutiny and peer review. The scientific community produces more and more data, software, virtual models. These new deliverables have to be valorized. It is our responsibility to deliver on research assessment systems that strive for excellence, but at the same time reward important components of science as a long-lasting fabric of knowledge and highly qualified people. Our researchers are at the heart of the European research and innovation systems and have a pivotal role in the growth, resilience, and competitiveness of the European society and economy. So I would like to reassure you, we'll not do that overnight. It's not up to the European Commission to tell you how and what to do, but I count on you to advance on this topic this year. So let me conclude now by referring to Michelangelo, who famously described himself as an artisan doing the mechanical work of getting rid of the superfluous to discover the sculpture that was already within the marble block. It is important to look at the transformation of science with similar elevated humbleness. It is our responsibility to accompany the transformation and extract its essence. Our collective responsibility asks us to recognize that mankind constructed the wonderful building of science over many centuries, a building of knowledge, discovery, talent, measurement, dissemination, freedom of expression, a building with open doors to allow for peer scrutiny and to pass the accumulated knowledge to new generations through education, contributing to improve the collective well-being through applied innovation. And it requires careful, I agree, but decisive action involving many and diverse stakeholders, using the tools at our disposal as policymakers, investors, as a community of science. I count on you. Thank you very much.
It is now my turn to thank you very much, Commissioner Gabriel, for what you said, and perhaps, I don't know if you will take this as a compliment or as an offense, but you almost sounded like one of us, yeah? Which I only mean as a compliment in this case, while on the other hand, in a very precise way, also making us aware of the contingencies under which you are operating, which unfortunately, or fortunately for you and for us, are quite different on the two sides. The bad aspect of it is that you said very many things that I would have hoped we would say during the conference. So you made it almost superfluous for us to convene, but this is actually more of a plus.